All right, welcome everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. So this is fun with enterprise apps. Two concepts that may not necessarily have entered your brain at the same time. So I'm going to talk about how we have fun building enterprise apps and making enterprise apps. First off, let's talk about fun. Is everybody having fun at this conference? Yeah. I don't believe you. Speak up. So what makes a conference fun? And for me, it's like there's several things that make a conference really fun, especially this one. This is one of my favorites. I've been to it every time except for two of them. So like meeting new people, learning new things. You always learn a lot of new stuff. Energy, like the energy of just having lots of people that are interested in the same things that you are. Kind of learning new things just like you are, sharing information back and forth. That's really fun, I think. Like getting help from people. It's really fun when you're like, I had this thing I was stuck on, and then somebody just threw it up on the screen like it was nothing, and I'm like, that was days worth of work that I've been banging my head against the wall, and now I know how to do it, right? That's fun. And last but not least, giving help, right? It's really fun when you're like, I learned something cool, somebody else was struggling with it, and I tell them, and I get to see that sort of happiness and release when people figure out how to do something new. So those are some things that make a conference fun. I'm kind of curious, what else? Did I miss anything here? Is there anything else that somebody is identifying as fun in a conference? Yeah. Travel, yeah. You get to go to a new place, experience new food, new stuff, new places to go and visit. Yeah, cool, all right. So that's fun. Now let's talk about fun in quotes. And this is I made this the asparagus color so that it would show up hopefully better on the screen and be sort of that kids hating asparagus feel to it, right? So the fun in quotes is the other thing I want to talk about when it comes to doing enterprise apps. And this is something that I'm like, when things aren't going so well and things are struggling and painful and miserable, I'll often say, if this is fun, we're having it. So that's something that can happen quite a bit in projects as well. So let's talk about some of those things a little bit. So what are fun in quotes? For me, number one, the long, boring meeting, right? This is the meeting that goes in circles and you think you've solved it, and then somebody's like, well, what about this? And then you go back in circles and you come back right to where you were, and you do it again, and maybe now you've not solved it again. Maybe you've lost your solution and you just keep wandering in the weeds, right? And then 3 hours later, you're like, I really need to pee. So those kind of things just really suck the life out of you, right? Deadlines, stuff that's arbitrary dates that aren't based on anything in reality, those can really suck the life out of you as well. Lack of focus and direction. Has anybody run into that before? Going in circles, like I said, in the long, boring meetings, that can actually happen outside the meetings, right? When you're trying to nail down what a feature should be, or figure out your scope, or try to get something solved, or just trying to figure out what's causing a bug, and you end up going in circles and everybody pointing at each other. That can be really frustrating and painful. And then last but not least, sort of a lot of the things that these all have in common is sort of that no feeling of accomplishment, right? That lack of being able to get something done. So that's what I mean when I say fun in quotes, is that sort of ooginess that a lot of this stuff is associated with, right? So we'll address that concept a couple of times later in this talk. All right, so what do I mean by an enterprise app? First of all, it's typically from a company, right? So a company is building an app, and it's typically for their internal employees or vendors. And sometimes what I'm talking about here might be for customers, but I'm not really talking about an app where a company releases it to the general public through the App Store. What I'm typically talking about here is something that an enterprise builds and distributes to people directly as part of their business. So it'll typically support a business process or something that the business does in the course of everyday activity. And then it differs from a consumer app, where the consumer app is really the product, right, or the business, right? So if I'm a company and I build an app and that's how I try to make money, that's different from what I mean by an enterprise app. What I mean by an enterprise app in this context is something that's sort of supporting a business process and it isn't really the product or the end means unto itself. Also, distributed with enterprise provisioning, not through the App Store. So what this means is that there's some different considerations and some different, you get some different flexibility than with the App Store. So in enterprise, when they use enterprise provisioning, they don't have to worry about approval or delays or anything like that. They can just manage their own release schedule. And a lot of times, apps and other software projects in enterprises are approached with what I'll call an enterprise mindset, right? You're looking to save costs, you want to get the minimum feature set for what you're spending your money on, right? You just want to get a lot of the boxes checked and get something done, and there's not really a lot of art or passion that goes into it. And in my mind, that's fun in quotes, right? Why can't an enterprise app be fun? So, how exactly do we have fun doing this? Well, there's three different ways, or three different sort of broad concepts that I want to throw out here as ways that you can have fun and enjoy, get passion, and really feel accomplishment building an enterprise app. First and foremost, be positive. Now, I don't mean be a cheerleader. What I mean is that you want to be interested in what you're working on and have a good positive mental attitude about the things that you're doing. Because a lot of times that I've seen in enterprise projects that I've worked on in the past, not necessarily mobile, where people have a defeatist attitude, or they're sort of torn down, or feel like they're not going to be able to get a lot of things done, or they're always going to run into impediments. And I used to be a competitive fencer, and when I would get up against an opponent that was sort of better than me, or like had a lot more experience, or was just beating everybody else, and you did that in my mind, I don't think I can beat this guy. Guess what? I lose. So the only way that I was able to beat people like that had more experience or were better fencers than me, is if I really believed that I had a chance to beat them, and I took it one touch at a time, right? Just one thing at a time, and really focused on and believed in my ability to to expand and do better than I'd done before. So that's what I mean by be positive. We're going to talk a little bit more detail about that in just a minute. Next up, delivering value. This is a really interesting one, and this is what I think enterprise apps should be focusing on. So when you are delivering value and you're making money or you're reducing costs, then you're having a different conversation than when somebody has just said, here, go build this for us, we need it, and things aren't going well. If things aren't going well and you're still delivering value, it's a whole different conversation. Last but not least, simplify. We'll talk a little bit more about this. But the more you simplify things, the easier life is, generally speaking. So let's transition into being positive first off. So what do I mean by this? So the first thing is, like I said before, it's really about your approach and your outlook on how things are going. So what I mean by this is not cheerleading, right? You're not just like, when things are terrible and you're just like, oh, come on, have a great attitude. We'll get through this, it'll be fine. That doesn't really help, and that'll actually piss you off more, right, when things aren't going well. So what I mean is it's really more of a way of looking at what you're doing, right? So you get to control your own sort of emotions, right? When things are not going well, you can get stressed out, you can get frustrated, you can be upset. But then if you take a step back and like, okay, well, let me figure out what's causing these issues for me, and then believe in your ability to go address those issues. And if I take those one at a time, then I can go work on them. I can go handle those issues, or go get help to handle those issues. Then I can feel that sense of accomplishment that I took something that was hard, I got through my emotional difficulties, and then I moved on and fixed it, and then I accomplished something. That's what I mean by having a positive approach and outlook to things, right? So everyone's going to have mistakes, everyone's going to have problems, everybody's going to run into this stuff. It's how you deal with it that matters, right? So that's what I mean by having the positive outlook here. So I'm sure you guys have been on projects where you're like, oh, this will never work. And yeah, that's fun in quotes, right? Is when you get that negative outlook, or those negative people in your projects where you're like, nothing will ever be good enough for them, or you get that feeling that nothing will ever go right. That's frustrating to deal with, right? But you have to distinguish between when that's a statement of fact, right? When technically, yeah, I can't download a 0.5 gigabyte of data in 3 seconds on a 2G connection. That will not work, right? But when something's just difficult, and somebody's going to go, oh, this will never work, that's a whole other thing, right? Let's step back, not be frustrated, not be defeatist about it, and let's solve the problems. So that's what I mean by having the positive mental attitude. So I want to throw out kind of an example here. Deadline is the one I threw up before. And deadlines can be fun in quotes, right? Where it's like, what I mean by this typically is when you have a deadline, or a date is going to arrive against sort of arbitrary, right? It's not based on some effort or some estimates or stuff like that. I see some naughty bag, and they're like, that. It sucks, right? When people are like, oh, well, you say it's going to take you 3 months, but I need it Friday. Okay, no, that's not going to work. That's fun, right? The term deadline to me just presents the wrong attitude as far as I'm concerned. If you change the way you look at it and say, you know what, we've got a goal. You say it's going to take 3 months, but I think if you try this new approach, you might be able to have something on Friday. That's different, right? It's a different way of looking at it and saying, you know what, maybe I could try it, and if I fail, it's still okay. I'm not doing something bad, right? And it's like, okay, I'll give it a shot. Why not? Maybe I could get that done by Friday if this new thing works. I doubt it, but let's see, right? So it's a little bit more fun to have sort of a different take on things where it's not punitive, right? But it's more like, let's challenge ourselves, right? So that's what I mean by it's good to look at how you communicate or how your team communicates. They're everyday terms that communicate the values of what you're trying to do, right? So what I would suggest is, you just look at the way you treat people, or the way that you're trying to set up your project plan, how you get things done, and have a positive way of looking at things rather than a punitive or sort of fun way of doing things. And you can still say no and be positive, right? When you know something is really going to fail or really not going to work, be factual about it. And it's like, okay, no, this isn't going to work, but let's look for another solution or alternative, right? So you still be positive about that, but not be just laying down the hammer. All right, so now that we've talked about sort of this positive outlook, and now we've got a project, let's go build one. So first off, selecting a project. There's some things you need to consider. First off is like, what devices are you going to support? So we have a client right now that's decided to go all Apple, which is great. And the funny thing was, they started working on iPhones, right? So they gave everybody in the company an iPhone. They're like, all right, we're going to have all that iPhone only. And we're like, do you want to think about iPads now? And they're like, no, we'll never do that. Guess what we're doing now? iPads. So it's good when you're looking at your project to sort of consider what your project needs to do, what your requirements are going to be, and what kind of things you're going to be able to accomplish with the devices that you have available to you. So obviously phones are sort of relatively small interactions, relatively quick. You've got location information, which is great. You've got a camera, you've got an accelerometer, you've got a microphone, and then you've got the ability to do some data presentation review, but you don't want to have like a lot of detailed information on your phone. So when you're thinking about what the best platform is, you want to consider those things when you're talking about a phone. Now, an iPad is interesting because it's got a lot of the phone options, right? It's still got that location. You could have location capability, microphone, camera, all that kind of stuff. But then it's a larger format, so you can do more stuff with it. You can capture more data. You can look at graphs and like lots of detailed data and sort of spend more time with it, right? So that's something to think about when you're deciding which it is. Then the watch is also a great platform that businesses should consider. It's really nice for notifications, right? Let's say you're a doctor. You want to know when things are happening, but you don't want to have a beeper going off while you're talking with one of your patients. Maybe watch is a great application for that. But again, that's something for a watch. You want to have minimal interactions, really quick notifications, quick responses, and some key data points. But it's got to be a very minimal thing. Last but not least, Apple TV. This is actually a good platform for delivering information in a static space. We've got conference rooms with Apple TVs, right, where you can throw up a graph of today's production values and that sort of stuff, and you can actually use it for presentations, or if people want to walk through some things that are in the app and display them to other people. That's a great platform for doing that sort of thing. All right. So now that you've sort of given some thought to what platforms should be supported by a project, well, now how do you even think about what to do for an enterprise? Well, I would propose that you think about delivering value. What do I mean by that? Well, first off, let's talk about what value is. So, value can be a lot of different things to a company, right? So, increasing revenue. Everybody wants to make more money. That's great. Increasing profits. That's great. Lowering costs. Yeah, you might be able to do things with a phone, and we've actually done this for one of our customers, where they can do things with a phone that they couldn't do with computers, right? They can send people out in the field and have them do things that they couldn't do with their computers. So they can save a lot of money by having an app on a phone rather than having to go collect stuff, write it all down, go back to the office, type it all in. They can save a bunch of money doing that sort of thing. Reducing task time. You can make apps that do things faster, right? If you simplify your processes, you can make things go quicker. And that saves time, and then people can do more with the time that they have available to them. Reducing friction. This is a good one. So this is the kind of thing where, one of the first times I rented a car when I was young, I went to Enterprise because I was too young to rent at Hertz. And I had to fill out this giant form. I was like, this sucks, right? It took me 20 minutes to fill out the form to rent the car. Whereas when you go to Hertz and you get the gold card, you make your reservation, you walk up, the keys are in the car, you hop in, you drive out, you show your driver's license, and you're gone, right? That's no friction, So reducing friction is very valuable when you're running a business process. And the ability to save those things and prevent people from having to do a lot of work to buy your stuff is a very good thing. Increasing capacity. You'll notice some of these start getting related, right? If I reduce my task time, guess what? I just increase my capacity, right? So if I have work that I have to do on a repeated basis and I can make it faster, now I can do more of it, right? And not have to hire any more people. Reducing complexity. That's very similar to the friction thing too, right? If I don't have to fill out a form that takes me 20 minutes, I reduce the complexity of my interaction with the company. And there's a lot of different examples of that, but and I would posit that most of the time you reduce complexity, you're going to reduce friction, you're going to reduce costs. So that's a great way to look at opportunities for things that will produce value. And then last but not least is pain points. So this is kind of one of my favorites when I used to do consulting back in the day. The easiest way to find out something to fix, ask people what sucks, right? What makes them angry when they come to work with you, or when they try to buy your product, or when they try to buy your services. And pain points will tell you a lot. So the things that people complain about are opportunities. They're not necessarily bad things. So look at those things and be like, all right, the customer's telling me what I should be fixing. And if I fix this, I might be able to generate value in all these different areas. So that's what I mean by value. Now, we're all programmers, right? So we like to do things in a very structured way, have tasks, and prove that what we do works, right? All right. So one way to do that when you're talking about value is there's a concept called Kaizen or Six Sigma. That's an approach to documenting and figuring out cost savings or improvements over time. So this approach is actually really simple. Well, it's simple, but it's complicated over time. So you define, what am I looking at? And that might be, some things in your business that you want to measure. How many orders do you do? How long does it take you to fulfill an order? What's the standard deviation of your order fulfillment time, right? And that's an interesting one because, let's say for example, I'm at McDonald's and I want to buy a hamburger. And it takes me roughly 2 minutes generally to stand in line for a minute while there's somebody in front of me. And then I get up there and I say, I want a cheeseburger. And I do it, and then I pay, and off I go. Well, that's fine. But what happens if that takes you 20 minutes, right? You're going to be flipping your lid or you're going to leave, right? So the standard deviation is the thing where your expectation or the variation that you encounter with a process is really kind of long. So you want to manage that as well. That's an important thing to focus on. So figuring out what you're going to measure is important. And like a standard deviation or a variation in your process time is often a good candidate for measurement, right? Because it can identify a lot of problems very quickly and identify the stuff that becomes a pain point or a very expensive problem. All right. So next up, you figure out what you're going to do, and you just measure stuff, right? And you get a bunch of numbers, and so now you got some data to look at. All right, then what do you do? Well, now you analyze, and you look at, okay, well, I got 100 orders, and most of them were 2 minutes. That poor guy at one time, he stood there for 20 minutes, and he was pissed. Wow. He talked to the manager, and we had to give him a free meal, and you know that was expensive, and all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's an opportunity for me to fix something, right? So maybe I'm going to look at that and say, all right, well, the problem was his credit card didn't work or something like that, or my point of sale system is dumb. I want to implement Apple Pay, right? So then, in my analyze step there, I would come up with a theory, and I would say, what if I implemented Apple Pay, and I could reduce my standard deviation a little bit and make payments faster, right? So that's my theory. I'll implement Apple Pay. And then I'll make sure that I've implemented it properly and I'm doing all the right things with my control step. And then I'm going to start measuring again. Now I go through the cycle and I say, did I actually get the results of my hypothesis? I implemented Apple Pay. Am I getting Apple Pay transactions? Are they saving me time? Are they reducing my standard deviation? Right? So this approach, when taken, and looking at a business that does, production or services or any of that kind of stuff, will continuously deliver value if you just stick to it, right? If you're always looking at your numbers, looking for opportunities, making hypotheses, implementing changes, and checking it out, you will save tons and tons of money over time. So that's something, when you do it, makes people happy, right? When your companies do that, they give out bonuses. It's all, people are happy with it when they see continuous improvement. This is also true in your personal life, right? If you see continuous improvement, things are good. All right, so that's delivering value. Now let's say we've come up with an app that we think is really going to deliver a lot of value. It's going to, prevent us from having to do a lot of work. Maybe we'll have to hire temp help at a certain time. Now what do we do? Let's talk about design. All right. If you take one thing from this talk, this is it. At an enterprise, please, 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 please use a professional mobile designer. Please. Did you hear me? Please. Please. Why? All right. Because what happens in a company is people are like, oh, I have a great idea. I'll just mark it up in PowerPoint because I'm not a designer. I don't know how to use, any of those cool designer tools, right? So I mock up this horrible thing in PowerPoint. And I'm like, I got a great idea for an app. Build this, please. It's that. And that's after you fixed it. So yeah, don't do that. Yeah, and every company I've worked with that's large does this, right? They want to cram as much stuff as they can on the screen, and you look at the buttons and you're like, no. So, yeah, when you get that, that's fun in quotes, right? So that's why I'm like, I encourage companies to really hire a professional mobile designer and really think about their design as a consumer product, right? You really have to look at it as something that would be the equivalent, or people would be happy to use, just like all the other apps on their phones. So that brings us to our third topic: simplify. Like I was just saying, think about consumer apps. When your users have phones, they're expecting Lyft, Uber, what other great smooth apps that are easy to use and do exactly what the user expects, no training required, right? That's what you need to be doing. So for an enterprise, sometimes this is kind of hard, right? Because for example, let's say I'm back at that rental car company and they require this form that takes 20 minutes. Well, do I put that form that takes 20 minutes to fill out in my app? That's a terrible idea. Nobody's going to do that. They'll get 3 steps into it and be like, this app's useless, toss, right? They won't use it. So this is the hard part of enterprise apps right here, is this sort of friction where the business has an existing process. You want to make the app super simple and easy to use so that it's as nice as Hertz Gold, right? So that I can right through. There's going to be friction there. So that's where some battles need to take place to simplify those processes to make that user experience smooth. So you need to look at the business process as you're designing the app and make sure it's smooth and simple. So what that'll do, when you've simplified things, that's going to minimize or eliminate the need for training. So when people are like, no, simplification is a waste of time, we're not going to redo our process, guess what? You're going to save money, you're going to get acceptance, and people are actually going to use your app and deliver that value that you've looked at and hypothesized. If you don't do the simplification, it will not work. And then you get the quotes fun, right? Because then people are like, well, what are those benefits you promised? Well, we couldn't simplify, so sorry, didn't happen. All right. So yeah, when you actually do the simplification, then you've got an app that people want to use, right? And this is stuff we all talk about at the consumer level, right? But it's not any different at enterprise level. So apps that people are using for work, they want to be as easy and smooth as the consumer apps. When you do that, you get these nice, smooth, easy interfaces, and that's fun. Because then people are energized, they're excited about your app, they'll give you support, they'll ask for help, they'll tell you when things are wrong. And if you haven't done this, people will just sort of silently go away. They're not gonna be confident. They won't push back. They just won't use your app. And then people will be like, why is nobody using the app? And that's why. All right. So another thing about design is it's not just about your UI and your UX, right? In enterprises, technical design is often a very big component of the process. So this is a generic diagram, right? It sort of describes all the stuff that needs to take place when you're doing technical design. So I've got, that's a terrible database, but that's what I mean, databases over there. And there's like some services, and I don't even know what all. In between, since people are going to be outside, they're not going to be inside the corporate network, so you're going to have considerations there that are often different from what a consumer app would have. Because a lot of times those services that the enterprise wants to use and expose on an app, when they built them, there was an assumption that you could never use that outside the network, right? So you got VPN, or you got to be in the office to use it. So you got to think about those things. And then going back to this, the data, you got to figure out where the data from your app is going to come from. How are you going to get it? In a lot of cases, you'll have like a web app or something like that, where people are, oh, we've got all the data there. All we got to do is just, make that work in the app. Well, those APIs aren't mobile focused, right? So you got to worry about that and make sure that your APIs will work properly for mobile and not just for web. You have all the stuff that you need to think about, like how are we getting to the legacy systems, right? If there's data in there and it's really hard to query and it takes a long time, it's not going to work for an app, right? You need to figure out how to expose that data and get to it. You'll need to know if you need to handle store data locally on the device. You need to know how the app's going to handle poor network conditions. How are you going to do offline? And if there's any special presentation concerns, like graphs or visual performance or anything like that. Then like notifications and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that you'll have to consider when you're putting your app together, and a lot of it happens sort of on that side diagram, right? So almost any enterprise project that you're talking about is going to have that component to it, and you'll need to spend time on that. And it's definitely good to do that during the design rather than where you're trying to build and realize, oh God, I can't get any of that data, right? Yes. All right. So now we've got this great design, we've got a great UI, great UX, we figured out our technical concerns as much as we can before we start digging into it, right? Now it's built. All right. So what do we do? What I suggest is prototyping. So this is funny, I'm realizing this is wrong. So So what I suggest you do is you build the app side, right? Just the UI, just the UX, and mark all that stuff that's highlighted, right? And do that in like a week or two. Do it quick. Then you've got something that people can look at. That's a prototype. So share that prototype with your key users. Now, what do I mean by key users? A key user might not necessarily be like your best performer, like the rock star person in your company. What you want are people that are perceptive. They understand the process really well. They may not necessarily be the best performer, but they really understand all the details, right? They know the exceptions, they know the problems that might happen. You want those people to look at the app. And they're open to new ideas and approaches as well. You don't want the curmudgeon that's been there for 30 years and is like, nothing should change. So you want people that are open to ideas, perceptive, they see stuff, and they're creative thinkers as well. And that they're willing to provide feedback. They're sort of good communicators. Those people might be hard to find, but if you have them, use them. So what you do is you share this prototype with them, explain any of the design decisions or any of that kind of stuff, or assumptions that are involved in the process. And then here's a very important step, and it's hard. Watch and listen. See how they interact with it. Watch closely how they react to it at first. You know, are they able to figure out how to navigate it? Do they have to ask you a lot of questions? That can be really illuminating. So then, listen to what they like, listen to what doesn't work, listen to what's confusing, and then don't be defensive. If they're telling you bad feedback, that's not a bad thing. That means they trust you. Listen to them. When they tell you bad things, fix them. And then you'll get a really good product. So when you do those things, that's actually fun. And in my experience, this is one of the funnest parts of building an app, right? Is when people are sort of talking about, oh, we should do an app for something, and then you come up with this prototype. This is their first interaction with something real, right? And then they're excited about it, but then they're like confused and a little disappointed. But if you get them talking about it, then you can see they start getting passionate about the app, and they'll tell you what's important about it, right? Because they're the people that use it every day. So take advantage of that. All right. So now let's talk about API interactions. A lot of enterprise apps will have this type of stuff. Just remember, mobile devices, limited processing power. So don't be, like I said, don't use the web API and send, 10 megabytes of data that you gotta churn through to figure out one thing to show on a screen, right? So optimize your APIs if you have to. Remember that networks are not reliable. You're going to have problems with this that are different from desktops. And so people in the enterprise will often forget that networks are not reliable, right? So their experiences with desktops, right? And so they're just used to things working all the time and having a fast connection. And so you gotta plan for this kind of stuff. And last but not least, I think I'm just beating the dead horse here, but please optimize those APIs and the payloads for the app, right? Be sure to handle those empty and the loading states. This is the kind of thing that's the level of polish for consumer apps where you can really tell the difference between people who spend a lot of time and a lot of effort on things, right? If you don't have that level of polish, that's where you build frustration in your app community, right? So the people that are using your apps will get annoyed with this. And then once they start getting annoyed, then you're starting to lose them. So the polish is worth the effort. Handle those error conditions well, right? So just assume that things are going to break in a lot of different cases, and you need to have a way to get out of it or to fix it that the user is going to understand. We run into this with apps where, even we didn't have really good error handling in a few cases where there were sort of edge cases, and those things can blow up and turn into a real issue rather quickly, and they start turning into a political issue too, right? So handling error conditions is not just about having the app perform well; it's a personnel issue as well. And if you don't do these things, the fun in quotes will ensue, right? People will be annoyed, they'll start calling people's bosses, and they'll start coming to you and be like, okay, what's wrong? And now you need to do an emergency fix and all that kind of stuff, right? So spending time on those things, the polish, the error states, all that kind of stuff ahead of time will avoid the fun in quotes. All right. I'd like to take just a minute and talk about code quality. So while you're building, one thing that's important is to sort of prioritize your quality goals, right? Do you want to build fast? Maybe that's the goal here. Maybe you're not building something you intend to maintain. Maybe it's okay to throw something out after a while, right? So maybe it doesn't matter so much. Well, maybe you're building an app that you plan to have around for 5 years. You want to make that really nice, maintainable code, right? So if that's the case, focus on that as a goal. Maybe you've got patterns that matter. If so, focus on those. Add those as a priority. Maybe there are certain paradigms. Maybe you're into functional or whatever other paradigms there are. If those matter to you, make those a priority in your code quality. Maybe you're into open source and you want to use open source, or you want to feed some of your work back into open source. If that's the case, you want to make sure that your code is a good candidate for being open source, right? But the key here is to think about this stuff before you start writing your code, right? Figure out what you want to focus on. And when you're doing code reviews or peer reviews or any of that kind of stuff, before you're into it, figure out what you want to prioritize and what you want to focus on up front. Next up, definitely use a defined development process. Mobile is new to a lot of enterprises, right? Git is new in some cases to a lot of enterprises. So we use kind of a modified Git flow approach where we have to develop, we have a master, we do features off develop, and then we move them up, and then we do a release process. And it doesn't matter what process you use as long as it works for your team. And so the key is just to have that defined development process so you're not making it up as you go along. Because that's where you get the fun in quotes where people are doing different things, stuff gets lost, and there's a lot of frustration that this doesn't need to happen. So if you have a defined development process that you've thought about ahead of time, you'll save yourself a lot of pain. And then things are actually fun to do. Peer review. So we peer review all of our code. So anything that somebody writes, even if it's the lead person in charge versus the intern or the kind of the lowest person on the totem pole, we peer review all that code. We do that for a couple of reasons. I mean, the first one is just to sort of make sure we're hitting our code quality priorities, right? That our code is maintainable for us, especially. It's important to remember it's not QA, right? You need to do QA, and this is not it, right? It's good to find potential bugs, but that's not really the goal necessarily. It's good to have sort of that conversation about code, and that's sort of a great way to share learning within your team. I've learned a ton from our developers about new techniques, and they sort of invent cool stuff, and I'm like, hey, we should be doing that across all the apps, right? So it's a great way to sort of share your code culture across your team, because it might be a large team. So when you do that sort of thing, and you look at peer review as not just sort of a way to like find stuff that sucks in code, but you look at it as a way to find new opportunities and new cool ways to do things, that actually ends up being really fun. And it's a great way to improve your culture. Last up, have a solid QA process. Can't say that enough. All right, so that's your build. Now you've got your app out in the world. Now how do you keep up with it, right? How do you keep up with all the changes? Because some enterprises are not super quick with upgrades, right? I've worked for several companies where I'm like, Windows XP, really? Still? Alrighty then. Sounds good. So one thing that we do is put analytics in the apps. It might sound kind of funny for an enterprise to put analytics in there, right? Because you're not really looking at it the same way. But I argue that you should. See how many people are using your apps. What screens are they using? Are things as you would expect, or are they different? That gives you some places to look and analyze and figure out new features in the future. Plan for your iOS updates. Don't get caught by surprise by iOS 11 taking away your home button. Right? Plan ahead for that, and make sure that you understand the implications of what those changes are going to be. So what we're trying to do is test everything at least a month before stuff gets released to the public, right? So go through all the apps, make sure everything's tested, and you at least have a good idea what's going to happen. With enterprise, typically they have a little more control over when people upgrade, but that may not always be true, right? So you want to at least know what's coming, and give people. It's better if you got we're aware of that issue. It's in our next release cycle. We'll have an update out for that in 2 weeks, right? All right, I can wait 2 weeks. I'll survive. Versus what? There's a problem? Uh-oh. That's a different conversation, right? So it's a lot more fun to be able to tell people the answer and say, hey, something's coming out in 2 weeks, than being surprised. This is kind of one of my favorite ones here. As an enterprise, like I said, you've got a little bit more control over how people upgrade and when people upgrade. Well, guess what? You can force people to upgrade. You can't do that in the real world. So drop support for your old devices as soon as possible. We're dropping support for old devices, or actually for old operating systems. So we'll probably be off iOS 10 by November, I would hope, depending on when things are done. That gives you the ability to use all the new API quickly. And that leads into my next step. So, oh yeah, sorry. That's fun when you get to drop support for old stuff, right? You don't have to have all the, if iOS 5 do this ugly stupid thing, if iOS 10, hey, I get to use the new cool stuff. You don't have to do any of that, just delete all the old code. So one thing that we're trying to do too is just have a WWDC watching party with people that are in the clients or the enterprise's information department. Because you can watch all this stuff and you can be like, oh, that's new, that's new, that's new. And people's WWDC is pretty exciting anyway to see the keynote and all the cool new stuff. But watching people's wheels spin when they see, oh, that's a new feature, we could do something really cool with that. Take advantage of that, that's fun, right? Then when you get these ideas, you go back and you evaluate those value opportunities. You go back to that delivering value system we talked about. You're like, okay, we got some new stuff here. What of those could improve our apps, could, find some value opportunities? Where could we save some money? Where could we improve our apps so they do great things for us? That is really fun. So, all right, that's what I've got for you today. I'm Joe Keeley. I work at Martian Craft. I wrote this book, Path Vector, a while ago. It's kind of old now, so if you still know Objective-C, you can have a look at it. But yeah. All right. With that, I would say have fun with your enterprise apps.